For 30 years my parents called me difficult. Loudly, not cruelly even, just quietly, consistently, in the way they introduced me to people, in the way they sighed before answering my questions, in the careful distance they kept even at family dinners. I grew up believing something was simply wrong with me, that I asked for too much, felt too much, needed too much explanation for things everyone else seemed to accept easily. 3 weeks after my mother passed away, I found a sealed envelope in her nightstand drawer with my name written across it in her handwriting. Inside was a letter she had written 2 years before she died, one she never gave me while she was alive. What it said completely changed the way I understood my entire childhood. My name is Olivia. I am 35 years old. Growing up, I was the only child for the first 6 years of my life. Then my parents had 2 more children, my brother Mark and my sister Wendy, 18 months apart from each other. Something shifted after that. Not all at once, slowly, the way most family patterns settle into place. My parents, Richard and Helen, were not unkind people. They fed me, clothed me, showed up to my school events. On the surface, nothing seemed wrong, but there was a tone. A particular way my mother would say my name when I asked a question that felt different from how she said Mark's or Wendy's. A small tightness around her eyes when I expressed disappointment or asked for reasons behind a decision. "Olivia, don't be difficult," she would say, almost like a reflex. I heard that phrase so many times throughout my childhood that I eventually stopped asking questions altogether. I learned to swallow disagreement. To accept explanations I didn't understand without pushing further. Mark and Wendy were allowed to ask things freely. Allowed to push back, to negotiate, to express frustration. When they did it, my parents called it having opinions. When I did it, they called it being difficult. As I got older, the pattern didn't fade. It simply became more sophisticated. When I chose to study art history instead of business like my father wanted, he called it Olivia being difficult about her future. When I moved 2 states away for a curator position I had worked incredibly hard to earn, my mother said it felt like I was punishing the family by leaving. When I got engaged at 29 and gently asked my parents to keep the wedding guest list smaller and more intimate, my mother cried on the phone and told my aunt I was being impossibly difficult about my own wedding. Meanwhile, Mark changed careers twice in his 20s with full parental support. Wendy moved across the country for a relationship that lasted 8 months, and my parents helped her move back without a single comment about inconvenience. I started keeping a private journal in my late 20s, not out of strategy, just out of a need to make sense of feelings I couldn't otherwise process. Reading back through years of entries, the pattern was undeniable. Every time I expressed a need, a boundary, or a simple question, it became evidence of my difficulty. Every time my siblings did the same thing, it became evidence of their personality. I never confronted my parents about it directly. I didn't have proof beyond my own perception, and I had spent 30 years being told my perception couldn't be trusted. My mother passed away suddenly from a heart condition none of us knew was serious. The weeks after were a blur of arrangements, calls, and quiet grief shared unevenly among the 3 of us. 3 weeks after the funeral, I drove to my parents' house to help my father sort through some of her belongings. He had asked specifically for my help with her bedroom, something he said he couldn't face alone. While going through her nightstand, I found a sealed envelope tucked beneath a stack of old photographs. My name was written across the front in her handwriting, careful, deliberate, clearly written with intention rather than haste. I asked my father if he knew about it. He said he didn't, but that my mother had spent the last 2 years of her life writing letters to each of us privately, separate from her will and separate from anything formal. I sat down on the edge of her bed and opened it. My mother's letter began simply. "Olivia, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I need to say something I should have said while I was here." She wrote that she had always known I wasn't actually difficult. That what she called difficulty was, in truth, my honesty, and that my honesty had frightened her because it mirrored a version of herself she had buried decades earlier. She explained that as a young woman she had once asked too many questions of her own controlling mother, had once pushed back against decisions that felt unfair, and had been punished severely for it. She wrote, "I learned that asking questions cost too much. So when you asked them so naturally, so fearlessly, I didn't see courage. I saw danger. I was terrified that the world would punish you the way it punished me, so I tried to make you smaller before anyone else could." She continued, "I am so sorry, Olivia. You were never the difficult one. You were simply the one brave enough to be honest in a family that had taught everyone else to stay quiet. I called it difficulty because I didn't have another word for the thing I was too afraid to become myself." The letter ended with, "I hope it isn't too late to tell you that the questions you asked your whole life were never wrong. They were the most honest thing in this family. I love you, and I am proud of the very thing I once tried to silence." I sat in that room for almost an hour after reading it, letting 30 years of quiet self-doubt slowly rearrange themselves into something closer to the truth. I told my father about the letter that evening. He cried when I read parts of it aloud. I haven't shared the full letter with Mark or Wendy. Some of it feels like it belongs only between my mother and me, but I have shared the central truth with them, that our mother carried something complicated from her own upbringing, and that it shaped how she saw each of us differently, often unfairly. Mark apologized for never noticing the pattern. Wendy admitted she always sensed I was treated differently but never understood why. I started therapy shortly after finding that letter. Not because something was suddenly wrong, but because I finally had permission to examine 30 years of feeling like the problem. I keep her letter in a small wooden box on my dresser now. Some days I still hear her old voice in my head saying, "Don't be difficult." But now I have her real voice too, the one she finally found the courage to write down. For 30 years I believed I was the problem in my family. It turns out I was simply the one telling the truth out loud. My mother's letter didn't erase 3 decades of feeling unseen. But it gave me something I had never had before, an honest explanation, written in her own hand, in her own time. Because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive when we need it most. It arrives when someone finally finds the courage to write it down.